have a particular focus on Asia in this research and some pretty stunning numbers that you dug up and came out with as an incentive to try and encourage businesses and governments to implement greater gender equality in the workplace. What are the potential economic dividends should we get to a place where gender equality is put in place in the workplace here in Asia?
It's a pretty big opportunity. It's worth $4.3 trillion in Asia if women were to participate more equally to men in the workplace. And that's not full equality. That's actually more of what we call a best in region scenario. So we looked historically over the last 10 years at every single region and the country that had made the most improvement in that region over the last 10 years. And then we matched that rate of improvement. So in Asia, that would be improving gender equality at the rate of Singapore. In Western Europe, improving at the rate of Spain. In Latin America, improving at the rate of Argentina. And when you do that, that's when Asia would achieve that $4.3 trillion. About 60% of it is from greater workforce participation from women, so just more women getting into the formal workplace. About 20% of it is from greater part-time or better part-time versus full-time mix. Around the world, women have the majority of part-time jobs and the minority of full-time jobs. And the last 20% of that 4.3 trillion is through sector mix. So men tend to be concentrated in higher average output per employee sectors and women in lower average output per employee sectors. And if that were to more equalize, that would drive the last 20% of that 4.3 trillion. You know, that's 12% of GDP over the course of 10 years. It's the equivalent of adding the economies of Germany and Austria to Asia GDP. So it's a significant deal.
To what extent does it break down across the region? And I guess the key question is, what are the policy prescriptions that you would advise policymakers and businesses here to consider to get to the point where we are getting gender equality in the workplace?
Yeah. So across the region, across Asia, it actually varies quite a bit from country to country. And maybe let me put Asia in a broader global perspective, because we did do this research across over 100 different countries. Globally, we created a very simple number, what we call a gender parity score, a very simple number between 0 and 1, 0 being perfect inequality and 1 being perfect equality between genders. If you look around the world, Australia, that you just mentioned, is at a 71 or so, a 76 in Western Europe and Australia, North America. Then you have Latin America at the 68 or so range, Eastern Europe at that same range. Asia is at about 58. So right in line with Sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit ahead of the Middle East, but Asia at 58 out of 100 in this gender parity score. And then within Asia, there's quite a bit of country diversity in terms of gender parity, both in terms of gender equality in work and gender equality in society. You have countries at the most equal side of that range, with the Philippines at a 71 out of 100, Vietnam at about 70, Singapore at 68, and China at 66. So those would be the top 4 performing countries on gender equality of this gender parity score. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Pakistan at 40, Bangladesh at 48, India at 50, Nepal at 52, and then Malaysia, where my mother is from, at 54. So that would be the other end of the spectrum. And then even within countries, there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of some provinces and regions within countries being at pretty advanced global averages and others at quite low numbers. So a lot of diversity in scores, for example, within India, as well as within Indonesia in particular.
And it's not just a question of jobs, it's a question of the quality of... Sorry, let me get you to carry on, because I know I asked you about policy prescriptions. So why don't you answer that one, Kweilin? Sorry for interrupting.
Not at all. So I think, policy prescriptions are, I think the question is, how do you focus on the key areas, the pinpoints in the workforce and in the talent pipeline? And what we see in Asia in particular in the workplace is a pinch point at those most senior levels of leadership in the workplace, as well as at the board level. And that's not to say there aren't other challenges. So for example, in secondary and tertiary education in India and Pakistan, for example, there are gender gaps. But the most consistent gaps that we see are at that leadership level across Asian countries. So for example, in Japan, 1% of senior managers are women and 3% of board seats are held by women. Similarly, in India, about the same range, 4% of senior management roles and 11% of board seats. China at about 11% of senior manager roles and 10% of board seats. So those would be sort of at the one end of the spectrum, at the low end of representation. At the other end of the spectrum, at least within Asia, you've got Australia at about 1 in 5 women in leadership roles and about the same 18% at the board level. And Singapore at 1 in 4 women, or 1 in 4 leaders at the senior management role are women, but only 8% of board seats. So across the board, even for the countries that are relatively well represented within Asia, still a long ways to go in terms of senior women in leadership roles as well as board seats across Asia. And so if I were to target the policy prescriptions, it would be at those levels. And you've seen examples around the world ranging from quotas that have been quite successful in a number of countries, as well as just more aspirational targets, partnerships between government and companies. For example, in Germany, Shisavche has been a collaboration between the German government and many of the large employers to share best practices and really raise the level of diversity across the board in many of those companies.
Yeah, Kweilin, it's Rish. So tell me, you're talking policy prescriptions. They're going to have to differ from country to country, aren't they? So what are the solutions here to get and empower women and get them into these jobs?
Yeah, I think if I look across different countries and the solutions that have been created, I think they have a couple of things in common. One, they focus very clearly on a particular pain point, whether it's women in senior leadership positions, whether it's women in the formal work economy. So for example, in India, 60% of women work in the informal subsistence agriculture. And so a solution in India targeted to those women, I think would be very important. But across the board, I think what we've seen more recently is that there's been a challenge, particularly with COVID-19, and you were just describing some of the record-breaking numbers in Victoria. I think we've seen COVID-19 affect both women and men, of course, across the globe, but particularly women, partly because they do much more unpaid care work than men. So around the world, women on average in Asia and globally do about 3 times as much unpaid care work, cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, as men. In some countries in Asia, that's as much as 10 to 1. So in India, women do 10 times as much unpaid care work as men. And because of that, we've actually found that jobs for women in this COVID-19 era are actually 1.8 times as vulnerable as the jobs of men. And so if we're not careful, I think some of the recent gains that have been inconsistent, but there have been gains in gender equality over the last few years across these countries, will be lost because we will make negative progress given the pressures of COVID-19 in some countries, with kids not going to school and additional unpaid care work challenges. It's a particularly difficult time in terms of work and unpaid care work for women and men.